friends. Welcome to the Mini Dairy Goat podcast. All things miniature dairy goat. Not too big, not too small, just right. I'm your host, Carrie O'Neill. Join me as I guide you through the enchanting and addicting world of miniature dairy goats. Hello, goat friends. Welcome to the Mini Dairy Goat podcast. So excited for this episode. It's been in the works for a long time, and I am super excited to announce our two guests that we have on today. Our topic is the history of mini dairy goats, and we're here today talking to Pat Fountain Fields and Jeanne Carson. And they've dialed in. We've had some IT trouble, but we've got this all worked out, and we are excited to have them tell their story. So before we get started, Jeanne, what's been going on your farm? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to.
Well, I still am raising mini Nubians. I've recently added mini La Manchas to the mix, mostly because they're easier to deal with sometimes than the Nubians. But I only have about 12 goats at this point, 6 of each breed, and it's kind of a nice number.
And where's your farm located? Where are you at, Jeanne?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, where is your farm at? Where are you located?
Oh, okay. I'm in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, between Albany and Corvallis. We've been here for quite a few years, since about 1977. We were in New Mexico for a short time, but for the most part, we've been in Oregon.
Cool. Well, Pat, I know you are not in goats anymore, but you've had some interesting adventures as of late. You want to tell us a little bit about where you're located now?
Well, yes, when I started my adventure in goats, I was in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. But I am now a Southerner. I moved to Florida, and then I relocated in 2017 to Southern Virginia. And I'm still in miniatures, only this time it's horses. And I do a program called Pony Partners, and we are on Facebook if you're curious. And we're looking probably 2 or 3 times a week. We travel to the elementary schools, even during COVID, and take miniature horses to do therapy with the special education classes. So it's been a lot of fun to do that. And, I recently ran into a miniature dairy goat breeder here in Louisa, Virginia, which is kind of what got me thinking about the old days again, too. So it's interesting that we should connect again.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I reached out to a few folks, and as both of you know, as we discussed, the mini dairy goats are just really blossoming as of late. And I decided to start this podcast and really wanted to have an episode, the history of mini dairy goats. Like, how did this get started? Like, how did people think of this? How did the goat registries get started? And that's when I tracked you two down, stalked you on Facebook, found you, and we're here today to help you guys share your stories with all of the mini dairy goat enthusiasts out there. So what I thought we'd do is just we'll start with you, Jeanne, and just tell us a little bit about what you were doing back in your goat herd. Just kind of take us back in history, and then we'll turn it over to Pat and let her kind of tell her what she was doing, and then you guys can just chit chat and kind of share how y'all connected and how this all got started. So I'll turn it over to you, Jeanne.
Okay. I started raising goats in about 1977, actually 73. I was living in New Hampshire then. And that's when I got my first goats, more as pets than anything else. But then I moved to Indiana and increased my herd for quite a while. And that's when I got my first registered Nubians. I didn't start showing goats until late in the 80s, but I found that my goats didn't do very well because I preferred a smaller goat, and I would get comments like, "Excellent mammary, beautiful goat, loses on stature." So I stopped showing my goats and just enjoyed them because I didn't want a big goat. And as we all know, they kept getting bigger and bigger. We moved to Oregon in 1977, and that's when I started increasing my herd. And when my youngest son was about 10, he decided that he had to have something different for 4-H, and he wanted La Manchas. So after I got a couple of Manchas, he was at the state fair, and I saw an ad in a local paper about Nigerian dwarfs, which I had never heard of. So while he was showing his goats, I went up and looked at them and ended up bringing 3 of them home with me. So for quite a few years, I played around with the Nigerians, but I still had a few. I had a couple of Manchas and a couple of Nubians. And one year, one of my Nubians decided to get herself bred to one of my Nigerian bucks. And my son wanted to show that goat at the fair, and there was no place to put it. So I showed it as a kinder goat, figuring that 4-H, it wasn't that big a deal. And of course, it did very well against the kinder goats, which was rather embarrassing at the time. But it sent me in a new direction, starting to think that it was nice to have a smaller size Nubian in my herd.
Jeannie,
And then
share.
my son's La Mancha. What?
Jeannie, share with the listeners what is a kinder goat. Some of our listeners might not
Kinder
know.
goat is a kinder goat is a pygmy Nubian cross.
Okay, so
And they
pygmy
were
Nubian.
developed originally. They were originally developed as a multi-purpose goat because they had more meat and they had milk. And there still is a kinder goat association. They haven't caught on as well as the many Nubians have, but they are still around, and some people really like them.
So you you entered it at the fair, and then what happened?
Well, the judges really liked it, but of course they were dairy goat judges, and they preferred the more dairy style on it. So at that point, I decided that I wouldn't show it again because I didn't want to compete against. There were a couple kinders there, and I felt bad about competing against the kids. So we didn't do that again. But it was just a couple of years later that I started realizing that there were other people that had Nigerian Nubian crosses as well as La Mancha crosses, which we ended up having eventually as well. And that's when I started thinking about how to register them. There was only one registry at that point that was taking them, and that was IDGR, which was a very old registry that registered just about any goat breeds that you came across. And there were a couple of other breeders in Oregon that were registering with them as well. Mm-hmm. But then I started looking into the possibilities of starting a registry. I was raising rabbits as well, and I realized that there really wasn't much to starting a registry. It was just a matter of keeping track of the breedings and the animals. And that's when I started MDGA.
And what year was that when you started MDGA?
I think it was 1995.
Okay. Yeah, for listeners, the MDGA, we've gone over this a few times, but that's the Miniature Dairy Goat Registry. And we will have a representative from MDGA on the podcast here very soon to kind of talk about that registry. But we're talking here with the founder of it, so that's pretty cool. So how did that how was that process to start the registry?
Well, there was a publication at that point called Ruminations, and also Dwarf Digest, and also before Ruminations there was another one called, I'm trying to think of the name of it, Footnotes. And they catered to the Nigerian dwarfs. So I advertised in there and told people what I was doing. At that point, I was also an AGS judge, so I was going to a lot of shows in various states, and I was just surprised to see how many people were actually doing the same thing, crossing the larger breeds with the smaller breeds, because, as we all know, a lot of us are on smaller homesteads and didn't have room for the bigger goats. So it kind of blossomed from there. And I know when I started out, I didn't sell many goats for a long time because I wasn't sure, especially with the Nubians, that it was going to work. Mm-hmm. I didn't know if we'd get the breed types back into the animals. So I waited quite a few years before I started selling animals, but other people were. And as we can see now, many, many years later, it did work. Yeah. There's some amazing miniature Nubians now.
Definitely awesome.
Hmm.
Well, that's kind of the Jeannie origin story. So let's roll over and look for the Pat origin story. So Pat, tell us about how what you were doing at this time with your goats.
Well, I started raising goats, I think 1979. That's what my old website says. And I started out with crossbred, just like everybody else did. And, I started learning about, quality and, better udders and those types of things. My little place was on an acre and a third. So right off the bat, you're going to know I can't have a lot of animals. And so I was looking for a couple of animals to have some milk and that type of thing. And like Lay's potato chips, you can't have just one goat. And besides which, they're herd animals. So I got quite interested in breeding and the genetics and that type of thing. I tried a couple of other breeds. And I thought, well, here's what I ought to do is I ought to get the smaller ones because then I can have more in my little barn in my space. And I toyed with very briefly with pygmies and found out very quickly that they're not dairy goats. Um, and there really weren't a lot of other things. And just then coming kind of onto the scene in the 80s, I think, were these Nigerian dwarfs. And I think they originally, um, the story was then that they had been sort of discovered in the zoos. They'd come in with the pygmies. Um, I think they came in as actually feed for the big cats that were coming in from West Africa or whatever. And so um, people started realizing that there was West African dwarf goats that were different than the pygmies, which are heavier in bone. They tend to be in a gouty coat, or they look like they can always have a winter coat, I guess. Um, they're a little shorter bodied and shorter coupled. And then there was this more long bodied, still short in stature, more dairy type goat. And it seemed to breed true, although the quality was all over the map, like any breed that isn't carefully managed. And so people began to they kind of name them, and they talked about Nigerian dwarf, and that got bandied about and kicked back and forth a lot. And eventually that name did stick, Nigerian dwarf. And of course, as you know, they now are registered with American Dairy Goat Association. That was something that no one ever believed was going to happen because they were very concerned about whether or not their bloodlines would make their way into the other breeds. It wasn't a popular thing to do at all, to crossbreed something, although when you were doing your own thing at home, you could kind of do your own thing. And then a kind of a lesser known story is that my Nigerian dwarf herd, when I decided to switch to this new thing I was doing, was purchased by a corporation that was operating in the Plattsburgh Air Force Base that had been shut down. I think their name was, can't remember, I'd have to look it up, but they're known as the spider gene goat, and they were creating milk that would turn into some kind of body armor. And they actually told me they were going to be doing research on, um, doing like in vitro fertilization kind of things with goats, that kind of thing. But they actually were doing the spider gene thing, which I did not know at the time when I sold them. And that was not super popular. But they actually did produce that. That is the
Mm-hmm.
thing. If you look
Yeah.
that up,
Yeah.
that actually did happen. And I sold them their first 20 goats that they started with to do that, which was just a kind of a weird thing that happened in back in the day. Um, so I switched to, I wanted something smaller. I really liked the Nigerians a lot. What I wanted though was something slightly larger that had a bigger, a little bigger stature so that I could reach under it and milk, and I could actually possibly use a little milk machine and all those things. But I wanted it small enough to still be easy to handle. I could have more in my small acreage. I really like the Nubians. I like their temperament. Everybody likes those puppy dog ears. And they were awfully large. They were very large. They were one of the larger goats at the time. They also were a nice dual purpose goat. They dress out well if you're going to be eating chevin. So that seemed like an ideal animal to breed and possibly bring down in size. And how I got the idea was because someone started the Kinder Goat Association, and that showed up in maybe Ruminations. I think might have been the one that had the article, and I thought, man, that's what I want to do. So I contacted them and got all the information. And I said, listen, I have Nigerian dwarf goats. It's a West African dwarf. Is there any problem with me using those? And they didn't think so. And then we began to do that. And I'd say more of them were out in Jeanne's neck of the woods, out in the Pacific Northwest. And so she ran into some. I never actually ever ran into any kinder goats in the Northeast, other than what I was doing. So I raised them for a couple of years. I was heading, I think my kid crop was going to third generation. And the Kinder Goat Association contacted me and said, we have decided that only pygmy crosses with Nubians will be considered for kinder goats. And, because we're really looking for the dual purpose meat and milk. And so we would, we're sorry, but, we're not going to continue to register the goats that are crossed with Nigerian dwarf. And so I just kind of put my feelers out there and said, hey, is anybody else doing this? And Jeanne popped up and she said, in fact, I am. And, we discussed a lot of things back in the day, back and forth. And Jeanne said, well, she was going to start a registry. So I went ahead and registered with Miniature Dairy Goat Association, and that gave my goats a home. And Jeanne was the only other one that had been doing it enough years to have anything that you could actually purchase that was up in the generations. The first generation or two were pretty airplane eared and all over, as far as their conformation and so forth. I had some I called Maxi Nubians because they got just as big as the Nubians did. Just, depends on what's what. And so I purchased a buck from Jeanne called In a Veil Curious George and shipped him in from Oregon. That was a big adventure for me in those days. And he was an awful nice little guy, and he produced some real nice babies for me. And then I had a little buck named Ranger who was out of my favorite golden doe. I had these real pretty gold ones and real pretty color. And I bred a little while, a few more years. I got some pendulous ears finally, which I was pretty happy with, and nice udders and a nice quantity of milk, a nice size and real good temperament. So I was committed to the Mini Nubian. They were promising to be a very nice breed of goat.
I'm curious, what were some of y'all's conversations or topics of conversations when y'all were going back and forth talking about your breeding programs?
Did you ever get a chance to show yours at all, Pat?
Just little local, like county fair, and I didn't do well because there wasn't anything but a crossbreed class. There was nothing like a kinder goat class. And so, like you, I got put down for stature.
Of course. Yeah. We had when I started MDGA, the first couple of years, I let anybody who put on a show have a sanction for free. I didn't charge for the sanctions because that made it possible for people to show them with MGA credit without having large numbers. And that was the best way to get people to see them. My local fair, we actually managed to have 2 shows each year. And at first, my husband said, "Well, why are you doing this? You're competing against yourself." And I said, "I'm trying to get the judges and the people to see them." And it really worked well. Most of the time I was running MDGA, we didn't charge for sanctions for that reason. And after I gave up MDGA, I was really disappointed to see that the number of shows got smaller because we had quite a few people racing them up here in the Pacific Northwest at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, y'all have got a couple
I think,
shows that go on up there, Jeannie. I think the Northwest Classic or Wine Country Classic, and there's some. I think it's fun because the shows, and that's one of my other passions, to get more clubs across the country and get more people showing so they can learn more about what makes a good quality dairy goat. But we've started up back here in Texas, and we've put on
Yeah.
multiple shows, so it's been really fun.
yeah, that was something I didn't get a lot of opportunity to do. I think I represented more of the homesteader looking for to to purpose the goat. I did some showing, and I locally judged. I think I judged our county fair for about 8 years, which is one of the reasons why I didn't show my goats there, because I couldn't judge and show at the same time. I was pretty committed to our 4-Hers and trying to help goats in general just be better quality in people's backyards than what we had. We were not in an area that had um, a lot of really good herds or well-known herds of dairy goats, maybe down toward our capital district in southern New York. There was a little more activity going on down there, and Midwestern New York. But there was a tremendous interest in the time at the beginning of the goat milk soap market, which has just gone crazy now. And I was doing that with the milk as well. So that was kind of my thing. But I was always very interested. I'm sorry, go ahead.
One of the nice things about the mini Nubians is that the combination of the Nigerian and the Nubian puts a lot of butter fat into that milk, and it makes really good milk. I always used to think the Nigerians had condensed milk because their milk was so high in butter fat that they could raise quads comfortably, even though they didn't have as much milk as a big goat. But
No, I had several sets of quads, and I had them in the mini Nubians in the early days too. I had a couple of sets. Yeah, that was fairly common. And you're right, the butterfat made for really nice soap, very, very high quality. As a matter of fact, I was one of the few people that mixed it with some water because it was just so concentrated. And it still made as good a soap as anybody that used full milk. But yes, I was very interested in classification, and that was something that I did get to do. I had a ADGA judge who was doing classification, the original classification before this linear that they're doing now, or at least that's what they were doing when I was done with goats. And it was very easy to understand, and it helped me to, just make decisions about what I was looking for in terms of how to improve my goats in the next generation. It wasn't all about the ears and the Roman noses, although that was extremely important. And in the early days, it was hard to get quality dairy goats to use for your breeding program. People were rather uneasy that we were going to use them for crossbreeding. but they definitely have made a market. One of the amusing things that happened in recent history, when I moved to Louisa, Virginia, which is a very small rural county north of Richmond, sort of triangulated between Fredericksburg, Richmond, and Charlottesville. And I picked up a little magazine called Louisa Life, a newspaper that comes out about every other month. And I think it was the first time I'd seen one of them. And on the front cover was a lady with two Nubian goats. And it said right on the cover in big letters, this farm raises miniature Nubian goats. And that was 2018, 2017, 2018. And I said, what? That's still a thing? I didn't even realize, because I had lost track of everybody. And so I went to meet this young lady named Shirley Keppel. She actually has a nice little herd of them here in Louisa. And she had brought a buck, I think, from Oregon or Washington State, her sire came from. And they're very nice type. I had purchased a couple of wethers from her just to have on the farm here for the kids, but they were unfortunately way too friendly, and the kids were a little taken back by them. And then they decided the best thing to do would be to chew the miniature horses' manes and tails, and we couldn't separate them. So I found a young man who just was dying to have some goats because his dad had cows and he wasn't allowed to play with them. So he gave them a real nice home. But, I was so delighted to learn that this breed survived. I did a lot of stepping up and helping with publications. Dwarf Digest got let go because the person had been doing it for years, and it was in the day of the little newsletter that you'd print up on a printing machine, and then you'd mail it out to everybody. And then we got computers, we could make something and we mailed it out. And then, we got to be able to do like newsletters and Yahoo groups and all those crazy things from back in the day, predecessors to the Facebook that we do now. And so I stepped up and said, well, I'll do it. So I did Dwarf Digest for a little bit, and that's probably some of how, Jeanne and I got connected. But, I think a lot of our early discussions were which lines of Nubians gave us the best type, what we were going to select for the next generation. It was pretty important because there were so few of us that we kind of were in each other's herd books, if you will. We kind of got real familiar with the background of each other's bloodlines that we were using, because we didn't have an awful lot to pick from. And you didn't want to go back too many times and start over, because it would have taken forever. I think we kind of came down to where we almost had to have 6 generations in order to really get anything that was going to breed true.
Mm-hmm.
True. And here in the Pacific Northwest, if you look at most of the ones that are higher generations, they all go back to either Hidden Creek or Echo Hills, which are really nice animals, but there's a limit to how much you can reuse the same stuff over and over again. And I'm glad to see now that a lot more people are starting over. It's not easy to do, but we need more bloodlines. And there's even a Facebook site now for people that are early generations of minis, because we need more bloodlines.
Yeah, I know a lot of folks,
that's really good to hear. And I've heard from some of the breeders as I've gotten back in, and Carrie, you could probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot more quality Nubians are people are able to access, more quality Nubians than we were back in the day. People were quite closed to the idea that we'd use them for crossbreeding.
Yeah,
unfortunately, a lot of new breeders are trying to judge their animals by the number of generations, which is unfortunate because
Hmm.
after you get to like second or third generation, you're there enough. You don't need to. I mean, I have a purebred buck, and he's really really nice, but he's not that much nicer than my second or third generation buck that I also use because he's different bloodlines. But
Yeah, that's
Hmm.
definitely
that's
one of the
something people
things
need to learn.
with the generations. I mean, even myself, I'll admit it, and we're going to have a podcast episode about it. But when I was learning about many Nubians, oh, okay, well, sixth generation, that's purebred. Well, purebred, that must be the best. And so I want purebred. And so that was just, the more that I've gotten into it and learned about it, I have a blog that just like, don't even look at the generation, look at the quality of the goat, the milk, the bloodlines, and don't.
Once you get to the third generation, if you meet the breed type by third generation, they then become Americans. And
Mm-hmm,
once you get to that point, it's just a question of what was behind them, not
mm-hmm,
necessarily whether a third generation is better than a seventh generation. Because at that point, that's
Hmm.
up to you. That's what you're breeding. But
mm-hmm.
by the time you get it to be an American, it meets the breed type, and hopefully you used good animals behind that, and that's good enough, at least in my opinion.
And to
Right.
yeah, to Pat, to your
No,
point,
that's good.
there are some herds, some Nubian herds that will not sell to many Nubian breeders still. But the good news is there are a lot of great herds that will sell to many breeders, and so you can really infuse
Hmm.
some good
And
bloodlines
there are a
into
lot
your.
of good Nubian breeders that have become mini Nubian breeders nowadays too.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
That happens a lot, and I think one of the things I always was a little bit, kind of, I guess the word jealous is a rather strong word, but was any of the more Swiss looking breeds such as Sanins and Oberhasli and all those, which I was an early Oberhasli breeder before they were anything worth having. Um, they were
I
just
remember
getting
those
started.
days.
Yeah, they
I do
they
remember
are
those.
they are so easy to breed because you don't have to try so hard to get a different ear and face, that whole and body, that whole Nubian type is the Nigerians are a very Swiss looking, so that kind of helps
The
you out a
silver hulls,
lot. I was
you have to worry about white spots getting on them. You have
Mm.
to make the color work, and that might be harder than getting a Nubian breed type.
You could be right about that. Yes, if they're sticking with that, you're right. And I was always stunned by how quickly that La Mancha ear stuck. They got they got that pretty quickly. It's a pretty powerful gene apparently, but it was a natural because the La Manchas were so cute that they came right behind the mini Nubian almost immediately, and then some of the others started to come, but the I think the mini Nubian was really the first miniaturized as I remember it. That was the vanguard, and then the mini manchas were right behind it, and then a few other people said, "What? Wait, I like this other kind of goat, and I sure wish that I had something that was a little more manageable and in terms of size." And I really think that it it's time has come, especially right now, as people are thinking more about raising their own food, having their gardens and their chickens and things like that, that the miniature dairy goat fits on the family farm. Um, and so the serious breeder has, quite a decent market for, their babies to the family farm, I would think. And I think that's a really good thing that, you're all making it more widely known that they're available, because that was the whole point, was to reach out to the family homesteader type person and have something that they would uh, have something worth having, that would, that would be a family animal, valuable and manageable by the whole family. And also, as you got older, that happened with miniature horses. As people got older, they got their horse fix by getting something really small that wouldn't kind of drag you around so much. Not that they're not still pretty powerful, but at any rate, yeah, that was the thing, I think. And I'm really glad that it not only survived but thrived. I'm thrilled.
Me too. Me too. Because when we first started this, we weren't sure it would work, especially with some of the breeds that were harder to get. But I agree with you about the La Mancha, because I recently got back into the mini La Manchas. As I get older, I find them a little easier to deal with. They're more willing to do things than my mini Nubians are the first couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a friend who has been a long time La Mancha breeder, and she breeds her first fresheners to Nigerians just for easy kidding. And she was taking those kids to the auction. And I said, wait a minute, you're taking your best quality animals, and they could be mini La Manchas if you're just selling them to the auction yard. So I've bought one from her for the last couple of years, and they're just stunning. And you're right, by the second generation, the ears are fine. Not that I mind elf ears at all, but by the time I breed them the second time around, I get the smaller ears, and they're really nice. And another point about the other breeds is the very first champion mini in the that got registered with MDGA was a miniature Saanen.
Interesting.
And she belonged to Stacy Morris from Flyaway Farms here in Oregon, and she showed her against the full-size dairy goats for 3 years in a row at our fair, and she beat the large animals every single time and got her championship.
Isn't that something? That's amazing. You made a good point, Jeannie. I think it was more planned than not planned, that people thought of the Nigerian to breed to their first fresheners for a more manageable first kidding. I think that happened more often than not. And people, because selling your babies for meat was fine.
It makes for easier kidding the first time around, but it also shows them, okay, if this first freshener doesn't turn out the way I like, I'm not going to be tempted to keep her kids. But if it does turn out all right, then you've got a really nice mini to keep.
Yeah. So it was interesting, there was sort of some aha moments all over the map with other reasons for making the cross, some being accidents, but many of them being deliberate, but not for the reason of breeding miniature dairy goats. And a few people said, well, then I think I like this better. And you all know, if you're doing it, that this is an adventure. You're pioneers. You're doing something new and exciting and different, and it's, it is hard to take a nice dairy goat and breed a line of dairy goats that's your own, that's quality, and it's definitely a challenge. But when you're doing something like an outcross and trying to make it work, it's like any new breed. It's exciting, and it's a real adventure. And you have to look at it that way. You have to realize you're a pioneer. Even people who are doing it today, and like Jeannie said, you've got to go back and start over, because there weren't enough people doing it. Like I said, there was only Jeannie and me, really. She was really the only one at the time that I could say, hey, can I buy something from you that was going to be different than what I had? Everybody here in the area that I was in New York, their stuff was all related to mine because they bought it from me. So it was, that we had nothing. And so when I bought Curious George, I brought in, something for everybody. And there is a young lady in Broad Alban who is still breeding them. She's never registered anything, but she has a little farm stand and so forth, and she has them, and they're quite nice. She's had a lot of them over the years, and so I'm pretty impressed with the quality.
I started out originally with some really nice Nubians and some really nice Nigerians, all lines that did really well in the show ring. But I was really picky about what I kept. And that's why at this point, I don't have purebreds in my herd. I have Americans. But, my goal was not to get to purebred. My goal was to have good animals that I felt good about selling to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of the enthusiasts are right now is they're learning more about the generations and like, hey, it doesn't matter that much. I can have, just like you said, Jeannie, a third generation can be just as nice or nicer than seventh if those bloodlines weren't good, getting up to those seventh and eighth generations. So, well, what is
Mm-hmm.
one thing that you guys, so I was just doing the math, and it's been over 25 years since you guys kind of went down. I mean, obviously you were in goats for that longer, but MGGA started in 1995, 96. So, it's been a while. What's one thing that surprises you to where the mini breeds are today? Maybe one thing positive and maybe one thing that we need to improve on.
It's a good question. I guess what surprises me the most is maybe just the emphasis these days on color, both spots and eye color. I know many years ago, when I saw my first blue-eyed goats, they were very poor quality, and I didn't want to have anything to do with them. But they've been bred to so many good animals in the last 20 years that now, there's lots of quality blue-eyed goats out there. And although that's not something I breed for, I have a few in my herd, and some of them are quite striking with those blue eyes. But I'm also finding that although a lot of people want spotted goats when they first get into them, I'm also finding people that want roans. I had somebody this year that wanted black and white goats. So one thing I like about the La Manchas and the Nubians is the variety in color that we can get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can really get something for everyone. So,
yeah.
Oh, sure. Well, I think the thing that surprised me when I found the Louisa Life with the mini Nubians on it was that it was still a thing. I think when I was done, I had gotten very involved in my human services career and wasn't able to continue to milk dairy goats and whatnot. We were still in the maybe this will work stage, and it was still considered just a crossbred and not really a breed. And Jeannie knows the struggle more than anybody because she was the one who stepped up and created a registry so that it could be a thing. And this other thing that surprised me was what nice type they were, how much they resembled that gleam I had in my eye in that day, what I wanted to see, what I hoped to have. I wouldn't say that very many of mine really looked like that. That what I wanted, they were headed in the right direction. I know I felt sure we would get them, but I wasn't getting them at the time. And I'm real proud of people for being willing to say, you know what, we need new bloodlines. There's plenty of nice Nubians and nice Nigerians out there that we could bring in some new blood, and I'm willing to start over and deal with the airplane ears for a couple of years and see if we can bring something in so that we have enough genetic material to keep everything going. So I don't know enough about it to say that, anything is maybe something to guard against, but I've heard both of you say that just be careful being too anxious to have that sixth generation so-called purebred. Remember, it's still just six generations of the fact that we crossed these guys.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a magic number. You need quality, you need type, and the appropriate size and whatnot. So don't be too determined to get there. Y'all have done 25 years of work, and you've gotten a long way, and you don't want to paint yourself into a corner by not bringing in some new blood. That's extremely important. That's something I'm working with a very rare breed of horse right now, and you can't go get more genetic material with these guys. And so we're keeping extremely close tabs through genetic testing and everything on the crosses that are done with them. And believe me, you don't want to be in a place where you just don't have enough genetic material and you start getting, some really bad stuff showing up. So that would be my caution is be brave, go forward, forge a new line, if you will.
Okay, so like a fun fact curiosity question. I know doing some research for this episode, I did come across at one point that we were calling them dwarf Nubians. Was that something that either of you were involved and then we finally decided on miniature Nubian or miniature dairy goats? Can y'all share a little more for the listeners on that?
Well, I can tell you my opinion on that one. If you know anything about genetics at all, you know that a pygmy is actually a miniature of something, whereas a dwarf is more, it's a gene that makes animals look a little bit, like out of shape, different size. It's kind of a different thing. And when the Nigerians first became popular, I had a real problem with calling them dwarfs because they are not a dwarf animal. They are a miniature dairy goat.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the pygmy goat is definitely a dwarfed animal, but they call them pygmies. But they got the name first, so we couldn't use it. And when I started MDGA, there was a lot of talk about that because they wanted to call them dwarf Nubians because they were Nigerian dwarf crosses. And I didn't want that name on there because it's not technically correct as far as genetics go. So that's when I came up with the mini Nubian. Now I know there were other people that were calling them other things. Some people wanted to call them, I think there was another one. Oh, I know Cheryl Smith wants to call her goats Oberon. I can't remember now, but it was hard coming up with a name that everybody could agree on. But that was my opinion as far as why I picked mini for MDGA rather than dwarf.
Jeannie,
well, I had a very amusing thing that happened to me, which made me agree with Jeannie. I was originally one of the ones that was like, hey, dwarf Nubian, it's Nigerian dwarf, crossed with a Nubian. I didn't really, I wasn't firm on any of it. I'm just like, okay, well, I see your point. And I liked mini Nubian. I thought, miniature Nubian or miniature dairy goat, that was more representative of what we were trying to do. But I had advertised somewhere that something about dwarf Nubians or whatever. And I literally had some guy contact me who was thinking that it was some, I think it might have been like a Yahoo group or something that we had started. And some fella came on and he was thinking that we were like some kind of maybe possibly kinky thing or something that, for people,
Gosh.
and, Nubian people. And I was like, oh Lord, we have to drop that name immediately. because it made no sense at all. But that was that. I just got a kind of a laugh out of that, and I said, "Wow, phew, there's weirder people than us out there doing crazy things." But yeah, like Jeannie says, there's nothing more pitiful than a miniature horse that's a dwarf, and that happens fairly with some regularity, and they have a lot of health problems, as do little people in our culture, and we definitely are not breeding for that. I know some people who kind of think that's cute, and they sort of they kind of look for that, and they're not real breeders. But it's not, because one of the things you need is very strong structure in order to maintain. We ask a lot of our goats. We ask a lot, and we want to have strong legs and feet. You think a lot about udders, and of course we think about ears and faces when we think about Nubians or La Manchas. But you've got to have the rest of the body structure good and sound and sturdy, and the conformation, it's good conformation for a reason. And so you don't want to give the idea that you're entertaining the idea of anything that would be dwarf. But yeah, that was quite a discussion, wasn't it? That was
well, I raised
at one point.
I raised rabbits for a while, and the Nigerian dwarf breed, if you got a double dwarf gene from two parents, the babies wouldn't live. It's a detrimental gene, and you can have it on one side and you have a small rabbit, but if you get it from both parents, they're really tiny and they don't live. And that probably was part of my thinking as well, that I just didn't like the connotation of dwarf, because it's not a very good gene. It can happen in dogs too. It can happen in a lot of animals, and it's a lethal gene in some situations.
Yeah, it goes. Yeah, that's a fact. That's true. It's true in a lot of different breeds of animals, that lethal double recessive. Yep. So anyway, it's quite amazing that it's been 25 years.
You mentioned being out of it for a while. After I moved back from New Mexico around 2000, that's when I had to go back to work, and I gave up the registry because I just didn't have the time to put into it. It was growing too fast from my ability to do it, and I passed it on to someone else. But where was I going with that? I forgot where I was going to go.
Well, Jeannie, while you're thinking of that, I had a question. So when you started MDGA and the registrations started coming in, what did that look like from the beginning? Obviously, you mentioned the first Finnish champion was a mini, I think you said a Saanen, right?
Mini Saanen.
Yeah. So what was it, proportionally way more mini Nubians, and then the La Manchas kind of came in after? Can you share a little bit about your history when you were there running MDGA?
Yes, the Nubians were the biggest at the beginning, and we got some mini La Manchas. There were a couple, Lisa Helgeson and Donna. There's another lady named Donna. I can't remember her last name, that lived in Utah. They were raising mini La Manchas, really nice ones. And there were a few people up in Washington, but it was mostly Nubians. And then a few Alpines, Saanens, and Cheryl Smith started the Oberhalsies, and she did those for a long time. So we had, tricklings of the other. I find it interesting that the Golden Guernseys are now represented in this country.
Yes, I have a friend who's
couldn't even get one.
Yeah, I have a friend who's going to be getting into some mini Guernseys, so that's exciting.
Yeah. I looked into them once at one time, just the big ones, and I couldn't even get them into the country. So I'm glad that they have some now. But I don't know. I see MDJ is doing Nigerians now too, and I don't know how many they're getting, but I guess they're miniatures as well.
Yeah. I'm
So,
surprised that there's another place that they would register Nigerian dwarfs once they got into American Dairy Goat Association. I figured that would. There were, what you may not realize is there were several different registries, and sometimes we would have our goats triple registered or even more. And registries came and went too. There was a lot of movement in the Nigerian dwarf.
I shared these
I
numbers
also
on
I also started NDGA, which is the organization, the breed club for the Nigerians.
Nigerians.
I was the first president, and I did the newsletter for a long time while I was in New Mexico because I had time to do it. And that was our big push, was to see if we could get in ADGA, because we felt like even though we had a wonderful registry with AGS, I just felt like if they were dairy goats, they should be registered with all the dairy goat organizations. And I'm so happy that they finally got them accepted there.
Yeah, I think I did some research and they were accepted into AGDA in 2005 and then they started showing in 2010. I believe that's correct. If not, listeners, please feel free to email me and correct me. But you guys are going to be blown away by this. I don't know if y'all know the AGDA numbers, but the number of Nigerian dwarfs registered with AGDA in 2020, 29,418.
Yeah.
Newbie.
They're the top number registered with ADGA now, and they didn't want them to begin with, and they probably saved them at one point because for a while ADGA's numbers were down during the last recession. They weren't having as many registrations.
Yeah, I think for the mini Nubians with MDGA, we're up to probably, I know some of my goats were in the 11,000, but that's just total. So we're probably up into the 12,000 total in the MDGA.
When I got my first Nigerian dwarfs, there were 900 of them registered with AGS.
Wow.
And I was the first person to have them in Oregon because they just weren't any. But, they're pretty prolific. It didn't take them long to take over.
That's a fact. That's really fascinating. Because I remember being like stuck out there like 3 people doing this. Way back then, there weren't people doing it. And then, gradually more and more people came. Leia was one of the second generation, founders of all of the breeds. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see how many there are. And I think the number of Nigerians being registered by ADGA really says what we saw, that we looked down the road and we said, people don't want goats to be so big.
Yeah, if they wanted a cow, they'd get a cow, right?
They'd get a cow.
That was a joke.
Right.
Ha.
Yeah,
exactly
I had some
right. That we used to call ponies. Some of my bucks looked like ponies. They were so big.
Mm-hmm.
That was way back.
Some of my ponies are probably smaller than your bucks.
The wonderful thing is the quality that the Nigerians have taken on. Remember, you talked about the differences in them. Like the gold ones appear more like a pygmy, and the some of the other ones were more dairy. And now they are all just amazing. I haven't seen a bad Nigerian in a long time.
Yeah, they really show up for the shows too.
Ones. Yeah. Pretty fascinating.
Here in Texas, we decided to change one of our shows. We put on our mini Nubian show with MDGA, and then we decided to put on an AGDA show and just have Nigerians and Nubians. It's like, this is what makes a mini Nubian, and we had a really nice turnout. And it was really interesting for the people that just came to watch to really see. So that's a great way to do it. Well, ladies, we've been chatting for a while now. I'll just kind of open it up for you for last kind of closing comments. Before I do that, I want to thank you again, both of you, from the bottom of my heart, because this was so great just to get you ladies on and get talking about this and being able to share this with our listeners. So I'll turn it over to you for some closing comments. Jeannie, you want to go first?
Well, I appreciate what you've done. Nowadays, podcasts are the thing, and everybody that wants to know more information, that's where they're going to get it from. There's a lot of things that new breeders are asking me these days, so I can refer them to your podcast because it sounds like you're going to cover a lot of the things that they ask me about when I talk to them. So I appreciate you doing this, and it's been fun to kind of think back at what we had done in the past, right, Pat?
It has been fun. It's kind of a weird feeling to look back and say, gee, I was a pioneer. I wasn't really thinking in those terms at the time, but I was thinking about making sure that what I did was responsible and was something worth having. And I think that if I had anything to say to new breeders or current breeders, it's just keep that, keeping on what you're doing, because goats are one generation away from becoming poor if bad choices are made. And of course, the great thing about goats is you can go, kind of etch a sketch because there's a 5-month gestation. But it's fascinating to see the number of people that just have a zeal for this type of thing, and it's gratifying. I felt sort of somewhat alone back in the day, and it's so nice to see that there's plenty of company at this point.
One last comment I'd like to make is when I was being a judge, I judge a whole ring full of goats, and they would all be good goats. But the person that was at the bottom of the line, usually it wasn't for any big reason. It could often be just a small reason. And I always used to tell people, don't go home and get rid of this goat just because you're last in the line today. What counts is what you want to see in your field and what your goat brings to you. Because in the end, that's what it's really all about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Great. I love that. Love that. Well, goat friends, let's thank Pat and Jeanne for joining us today on our History of Mini Dairy Goat episode. I hope you enjoyed it. We've got a lot more episodes in the works, but this one's going to be hard to top. So, goat friends, happy goating, and we'll check in with you guys later. Hey guys, thank you so much for listening to the Mini Dairy Goat podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast for our new episodes. Share the podcast, tell all your goat friends about us, rate and review the podcast, and also you can hit us up on our Facebook page, Mini Dairy Goat Podcast, for more information and show notes. Thank you so much and happy goating.